Good morning, Year 11, and welcome today to your Elizabeth paper walkthrough for the Elizabeth topic at GCSE History. So for Elizabeth, you are going to get a question paper which is on the left hand side, and we know we're getting an hour for this question paper. And on the right hand side, you're going to get an interpretations booklet, so it will look like this on the front of the interpretation, and then if you switch it over, it will have this usually on the back. So that's the interpretation, and that's for question 1. So if we look and open up our paper, we always know that it's going to start off with an interpretation, and this one says, study interpretation A in the interpretation booklet. How convinced is interpretation A about Essex's rebellion? Explain your answer using interpretation A and your own knowledge. So straight away we know that's spend knowledge. We can see it's 8 marks, so it's going to be 12 minutes. And it's going to be times 2 paragraphs. And after we read the question, the first thing we do is ask what part of history is the question asking us about. And we know that it's going to ask us about Essex's rebellion. Okay, that's the history you've been taught about, and we also know that we need to use interpretation A to help us do that. So you would get your interpretation, you would read through it, you would pick out 2 things about Essex's rebellion. So for example, I might say that Essex's rebellion, to do well, we know that he had an intense relationship between the Queen and Essex, but it worsened. Now that tells me like one of the causes of the rebellion, and it talks specifically about the rebellion here where it says he tried to smash his way to political power, but it was a disaster. So those are my 2 quotes. So I've got those, and now I need to back them up with own knowledge. So I know that for the structure of this, I need to use a quote. And my quote was about the intense relationship worsening. And I would then use own knowledge to back this up about Essex's rebellion. So how do we know that that intense relationship worsened? So I'd be pointing out that he used to have a sweet wine monopoly. That he was a favourite of the Queen. So again, I'm just doing this in note form. However, we know that it was quite an intense relationship, and that's that, but we know that it worsened over time. We know that there was a Privy Council meeting where Essex drew his sword. We know that he was put under house arrest. We know that he was given another chance, but he was betrayed, or he betrayed Elizabeth in Ireland by suing for peace. So again, it's the level of detail with your own knowledge that's going to pick you up the marks. And overall, what does this tell us then about Essex's rebellion? Well, it tells us, if we link it back to the question, it tells us about the cause, or one of the causes of his rebellion. So again, this bit here, if we look, the quote from interpretation A should just be a sentence. We know it's convincing because it says. And then we've got our own knowledge. And the level of detail within that own knowledge is what's going to get us the marks there. And again, we'll go on to the second bit. So again, you just need the same. You need a second quote. So if you just do this, this is 4 marks. So you're going to be stuck there. So again, quote, tried to smash his way to political power, but it was a disaster. So again, just note form. You'd write in full sentences. And again, own knowledge here, right, how do we know he tried to smash his way to power? Well, his 200 soldiers took 4 Privy Councillors hostage. We know that he was planning on marching into London. We know it was a disaster because he was his soldiers abandoned him after being called traitors. We also know that Cecil defeated Essex. We know that Essex was executed. So again, keep linking it back to your quote. Smash his way to power. Well, how did he smash his way to power? 200 soldiers. How did he try and smash his way to power? Marching on London. Why was it a disaster? Abandoned traitors. Why else was it disaster? Cecil defeated him. Why else was it disaster? Essex was executed. So we're linking it back to that quote. That's what we should be looking for from an interpretation question. And we can see that nicely analysed there on the paper. So we know, just to summarise, that question 1 will always ask us how convincing is interpretation A about, and then a part of history. So let's move on to question 2 now. And question 2 asks us, explain what was important about Queen Elizabeth's court. It's 8 marks. So I know straight away that I'm looking at 8 marks, I'm looking at 12 minutes, and I'm looking at 2 paragraphs. And what part of history is the question asking me about? Well, I can see the knowledge that your teachers taught you, Mr. Hughes has taught you, is that it's about Queen Elizabeth's court. And the rest of the question asks me to explain what was important. Now I need to ask myself, is this a source question? Nope. Is it an interpretation question? No. So that must mean I must use PEE for my answer. And I need, again, 2 of those paragraphs. So in my point, I would make a judgment. How important was Elizabeth's court? So I would agree with the question. So I agree, and I make a judgment. My evidence needs to be spend. Statistics, places, events, names, dates. As detailed as you can make it. And then my explanation, why is it important? Who is it important for? And you can expand on that by this led to, this meant that. And again, you're going to need 2 of those paragraphs. So, for example, I might say it was important. I might use some evidence pointing towards the fact that it was the centre of political power, mentioning that the Privy Council were there, that her nobility were invited. I might explain that it was important for Elizabeth because she was able to control them there through banishment, through patronage, through monopolies, again using specific examples such as the Earl of Essex. I would also say that's one person it's important for. You could also say it's important nationally because it's a show of unity. You know, if they weren't there, what would have happened? So not there could have been a disaster. So questions of the Queen. So it's really important. Elizabeth's court is really important for that power structure in England. So again, as you can see from the structure, you're giving some really detailed evidence, but where it really comes into the marks is that second order concept, explaining why it's important. Okay? So always explaining why it's important and detailed. And to get those top marks, it's about who it's important for. Groups of people, individuals, go into that level of detail. Again, if you were looking at a second paragraph because you'd want to, you would again agree with the question, or this time make a judgment. So you would say it was slightly important. So here I might be saying it was vitally important. So it's vitally important to the Queen, it's vitally important to the country. Here I might say it's somewhat important. Okay, my evidence there would be it was the centre of fashion. And I would use examples of fashion from Elizabethan court. So I might use makeup. I might use the food. the wine, the dress, so the coloured dye. So again, using that level, a good strong level of evidence, that spend evidence. And then I would go on to explain, right, who is this important for? Well, it's important for the rich. They're able to show off. And again, be specific about who the rich are. So I'd be saying the nobility, the gentry, worthy of attention. And then you could flip it and you could say, well, it's also important for the poor. So again, that's my other group. Okay, reminds them of their place. You know, those ashen face from working outside all the time. Looking at these rich people with white makeup on, reminding them that, you know, they are there to serve. You know, it enforces the social hierarchy, doesn't it? And that's a really nice thing that you can say in your answer there, if this question ever came up. And again, we can see here some nice spend evidence, but really what's going to get you the marks is that level of explanation, why it's important. So we mix it up, don't we? So that's how you answer your 8-mark explain what was important question. It's a really nice question. We should be aiming really for top of level 3, so 6, 7 or 8 marks on this question. It's a nice question to get, whatever comes up. Okay, Year 11, so let's move on to question 3 now, which is write an account of the ways in which the voyages of discovery affected Elizabethan England. And it's 8 marks, so I can see that it's going to be 12 minutes of writing time, which means I need 2 paragraphs as well. So the first thing I would do here is I would cross out write an account and write explain. The reason I'm going to do this is because a lot of people, when they see write an account, they just tell the story of the voyages of discovery, when that's only going to get you 2 marks maximum. What you need to do is you need to split the question in 2. So what part of history is this question asking us about? Well, I can see that Mr. Hughes has taught me about the ways in which the voyages of discovery affected Elizabethan England. So I can see that's the history. Now this question with the write an account is always a little bit different, because what it does is it asks you to then explain how the voyage of discovery affected Elizabethan England. So it means that when you're sort of highlighting the question, it sort of overlaps a little bit, which is why we've done 2 colours there, because you need to have some evidence about voyages of discovery affecting Elizabethan England. They need to explain how it affected Elizabethan England. So they do overlap a little bit, so it's worth knowing that about question 3, because the other questions don't do that, but these ones can do that. So, in terms of what we're looking at now then, is the structure. Now, I know it's not an interpretation question, so I don't need to do that. I know it's not a source question, so it means that my structure is going to be PEE. And I'm going to start really simply. Again, we know that with point evidence explain, we agree with the question, and we can always make a judgment for our top marks. And our evidence has to be spend, and our explanation then has to be about the second order concept, so explain how it affected Elizabethan England. So again, who it affected, why or how it affected them, and again, using this meant that this led to. So thinking, so what? And if we're thinking about actually how to answer this question, I would start by saying, point, it affected, I'm going to put EE for Elizabethan England, significantly. What example do I have of a voyage of discovery affecting it significantly? Well, I could talk about Drake. I could talk about, again, wanting to use spend evidence, circumnavigation, Again, wanting to use more spend evidence to impress the examiner. So circumnavigation, attacking the Spanish ships. If you can name one, even better, Cagfuego. Again, stealing £480 million worth of treasure. Okay, and this is where we get our marks. Who is that going to be significant for? It's going to be significant for Queen Elizabeth. Why is it significant for her? Embarrass the Spanish. Why is this so good? We don't just stop at embarrass the Spanish. So what? This meant that their Catholic enemies lost face. That's why it's good for her. Okay, who else is it going to be good for? The patrons who pay, because they are financially reimbursed. So that's how it affects Elizabethan England in those two ways. You could talk about other things as well, but that's just a couple of different groups that you could definitely talk about there. So again, if we look at sort of our evidence, it's specific, it's spend evidence. Just make sure I've got the right colour. And then again, with our explanation, where we're picking up the marks. Here, two different groups. We've got Queen Elizabeth and we've got patrons. And I'd be really focusing here. Do not be worried in an explain question about explaining the negative effect. Okay, a lot of people think you can only talk about the positive effect, and I would actually just pause and go back to the importance. Don't be afraid when you're talking about importance that this can be both positive importance and negative importance. And it's the same here, the positive effect and the negative effect on different groups. Now I might go on to talk about I should go on to talk about another voyage of discovery because I need 2 marks. So I might be saying it affected Elizabethan England slightly. I might talk about the evidence of Rayleigh and the fact that his voyage of gaining Virginia. And my explanation there then, so who is that significant for? Well, I've said it's slightly significant for Queen Elizabeth. It raises, it takes land for her, which is good. Okay. Really positive. It spreads Protestantism as well. And that's really important because of the Spanish spread in South America. So it's also good for the Protestant church in turn. Now here, and it's good because I'm doing this live so you can see the mistake that I've made. I've started by saying this is slightly affected Elizabethan England. But if you actually think about what I've explained, I don't think that's slightly. I think that's really significant. Now, I've used the word significant up here, so I might want to change it to something like seismic. Okay? So that's what you can do in your answer. If you actually think, that's not slightly, that's a lot bigger, or if you put seismic and it's not really having an impact or an effect, slightly, you could change it back. So I've actually changed that to seismic effect, This is what Elizabeth is there for. She's the head of the Protestant church. So again, thinking about our answer as we go. Don't be afraid to change it as you go as well. Just if you feel like it's wrong, you've made that judgment and you're after a level 4, which is, your 7, your 8 marks. So again, if we look at the structure, and this is what you need to be highlighting your questions so you can think of the structure as you go. The evidence that I've used then, a couple of really detailed sentences there, and the explanations, strong, detailed explanations, talking about different groups, Queen Elizabeth, and then also talking, here about the Protestant church benefiting from it as well. And finally, the question that we know is going to come up, or at least we know it's going to be on the Globe Theatre, question for 16 marks. So you've all been given waggles for this, so you should be prepared to go straight into this question and start writing. However, it's also worth figuring out what your sentence starters are going to be. So you still need to analyse the questions. So, again, we read the question. Privy Council patronage was the main reason for the success of the theatre during Elizabeth's reign. How far does your study of the Globe Theatre support this statement? 16 marks, 4 paragraphs at the most, 3 P paragraphs, and 1 conclusion. And it's 16 marks, so you're going to have 24 minutes on this. Now, what a lot of people do is they start with the 16 marker and work backwards. It's completely up to you how you do those things. And we'll speak more about that in class for some tips. But it's the same sort of structure. What part of history has Mr. Hughes taught you about? Well, he's taught you about Privy Council patronage. And the rest of the question is asking you about the reason for the success of the theatre during Elizabeth's reign. Now, I know that this might not always be reason. It might be, which reason means cause, but it also might be change, and it might be consequence. And if it is those things, that's what your sentence starters need to be around. But we'll use this example for now. So, in the centre, we draw a triangle, and then we draw triangles coming off it. So you still plan even if you've got those waggles in mind, because you want to make sure you've got those sentence starters right, that you know if it's asking about reason, change or consequence, so you can slightly adapt those waggles as you go. So here I'm going to say we know that it's Privy Council patronage is one factor, and in the centre it's going to be reasons for success. Now, I also know that the factors I've been given are important people, important events that link with the theatre, the location, and the design. So I get to pick whatever I'm more comfortable with. So I know that me as a historian, I really like the design of the Globe Theatre and writing about that. I also know that I'm really confident about the location and why that leads to success. So I've got my plan there. And I know that I've got some evidence here for location, because I know that it's not a source question, it's not an interpretation question, which means it's going to be P, E, E. So my evidence just in terms of my plan. So I'm thinking, right, what did my waggle say for location? And I'd be talking about the movement to the Thames, so I'm just going to write that as a quick note there for myself, and how that led to a success. Again, design, it was like a Roman amphitheatre. Again, I can remember much more detail, but I'm just getting it down into my head. And then Privy Council patronage, I'm going to talk about Dudley. Again, going into the reasons for success. So it is point, evidence, explain. And we know that we want to be really giving some spend detail about the evidence, which is here. But it is really keep linking your explanation back to success. That is going to get you the marks. So why being at the River Thames was a success? Why being an amphitheatre was a success? Why being, Robert Dudley was a success? Now again, if this was, for example, and I'll draw another triangle here but use the same examples, if the question asked me about change, it would be the same process. If it asked me about consequence of the development of the theatre, it would be the same process. Sorry, that was rubbish consequence. You can use the same examples. You can use location. You have to use Privy Council patronage. Design. And again, the same here. You can use location for consequence. You can use Privy Council patronage for consequence. You can use design for consequence. You can use the same evidence. So you can use Dudley. You can use the location of the Thames. You can use the amphitheatre for design. And then how did that lead to change? How did this lead, or what did that change lead to? So you're using your waggle and you are adapting it to whatever the question is and going inwards. And you can do the same with consequence as well. So that's how you go about planning your 16 marker, and you know that those waggles you are going to use in your answer. You just need to change the sentence starters, whether it fits reason for success, change, or consequence, and all those examples are on your waggles that you can look over. But just make sure you plan first.